Okay, well, I think let's get started. Um, Good morning and good evening, everybody, and welcome to the latest in our Diplomat webinar series. My name is Sebastian Strangio. I am the Southeast Asia editor at the Diplomat. And I'm pleased to be joined by a very distinguished panel today to discuss the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, its past, present, and future relevance in a quickly changing world. The obvious prompt for this discussion is the recent military coup and subsequent political crisis in Myanmar, which has brought international attention to bear on ASEAN's ability to solve pressing issues in its own neighborhood. For many skeptics of ASEAN, the Myanmar crisis has simply reconfirmed their view that it is an organization that is not fit for purpose. Some of ASEAN's defenders point out that the Southeast Asian bloc's mode of consensus-based negotiations offer perhaps the best way forward in what is a very thorny political crisis in Myanmar. But in general, the crisis has shone a light, has revived old debates about the relevance of ASEAN in a changing world. It has reactivated old criticisms of ASEAN's inability to handle issues in its neighborhood, from refugee crises to the rising power and assertiveness of China to its north. And the Myanmar crisis has also, called into question whether ASEAN deserves its much cherished position of centrality in the region's diplomacy, and even reopened a debate on what centrality means in an age of increasing superpower rivalry between China and the United States. These debates in turn seem to hint at a more fundamental question: whether a regional organization that was established at the height of the Cold War and designed to bridge and reconcile the clashing sovereignties of post-colonial Southeast Asia offers a blueprint for the challenges of the increasingly connected and interdependent world of the 21st century. To discuss these and other questions, I'm very privileged today to be joined by a distinguished panel of regional commentators and experts. Our first speaker will be Ian Chong, an associate professor of political science and associate research fellow with the East Asian Institute at the National University of Singapore. Ian's work has appeared in many academic journals, including China Quarterly and the European Journal of International Relations. And he is also the author of External Intervention and the Politics of State Formation, China, Thailand, Southeast Indonesia, 1893 to 1952, which received the 2013 Best Book Award from the International Security Studies section of the International Studies Association. Joining him from Singapore is Huang Thi Ha. Ha is the lead researcher for political security affairs at the ASEAN Studies Center at the Isaias Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore. She has also held posts in the ASEAN Department of Vietnam's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and spent 9 years working in the ASEAN Secretariat in Jakarta, with her last post being Assistant Director, Head of the Political Cooperation Division. She holds an MA in International Relations from the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam. And rounding out our panel is Evan Laxmana, a political scientist and senior researcher at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Jakarta, Indonesia's premier foreign policy think tank. Evan has held visiting and research positions with the National Bureau of Asian Research, Sydney University's Southeast Asia Center, the Lowy Institute for International Policy, the German Marshall Fund of the United States, and the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at NTU in Singapore. He earned his MA and PhD in political science from Syracuse University's Maxwell School. So before we begin, just a quick note on format. I will be inviting each of the speakers to talk for about 10 minutes on various aspects of ASEAN and its present challenges. And after that, I might pose a question or two just to get some discussion going between the panelists, after which we will then move on to the Q&A. If you have any questions for our panelists, either for a specific panelist or just for the panel as a whole, feel free to enter it in the chat box within the Zoom console. And then when we get to the Q&A, I will curate and select some questions to ask the panel, and we can carry that through to the end of our session in about just over an hour's time. And so without further ado, I'd like to call on Ian to kick off our proceedings and to discuss a little bit about how the crisis in Myanmar has reactivated a lot of pre-existing skepticism about ASEAN and its ability to handle the challenges of the 21st century.
Thank you, Sebastian. Also, thank you to the diplomat for the invitation. I'm honored to be here to share some thoughts with you and to engage in a further discussion. So I guess where I'll start is to talk about the risks that the current crisis in Myanmar has brought up for ASEAN and has perhaps reminded us of some of the areas where ASEAN might need to do a little bit more. So I think it's also it's useful at this point to remember that the proposed ASEAN special meeting over Myanmar is due to take place this Saturday. That's almost 3 months after the coup in Myanmar. So why is this particularly pressing? I think for ASEAN, the real risk here is that we may have a failed state, in our region. What does that mean? It means potential spillover in fighting, refugees, human trafficking, a rise in narcotics trade, conflict gemstones, possibly arms running, and as people on the coast get desperate, perhaps piracy towards the northern end of the Strait of Malacca. So these are clearly issues that will affect all of ASEAN, either directly or indirectly, even those on the eastern coast, because insofar as they also depend on the Strait of Malacca, this is going to potentially affect them. So what's on ASEAN's plate is quite a bit, and the key is to try to avoid the sort of worst outcomes, right? And you can imagine when all these things start swirling around, there will be entities, criminal organizations, they'll be fighting over the profits and all that come from the potential unrest. So what this brings up then is a question of whether ASEAN is able to keep its own house in order. And this ability to maintain order within Southeast Asia is fundamental to ASEAN's ability to claim that it's somehow in the driver's seat, it's somehow able to take some initiative in regional affairs, that it is key in terms of being central, that all actors who want to have any dealings with Southeast Asia need to take in regard ASEAN's sort of preferences and its interests. And insofar as ASEAN is able to present that sort of more united type of position, it will possibly have more say. The degree to which it is unable to, especially on an issue as pressing as the current Myanmar crisis, this will be very deleterious, right, to those sorts of claims of centrality and being in the driver's seat. Part of this also comes down to, as Sebastian had mentioned, we're now at a moment of intensifying major power competition. So ASEAN's ability to hold itself together also means an ability to work more effectively with major powers like the United States, like the PRC. And that ability to sort of work with and to be respected by major power capitals will be quite key to ASEAN having its own say in ASEAN members being able to exercise their own autonomy in terms of determining where the direction of the future of the region might go, right? And some of the sort of other follow-on issues that come from the Myanmar crisis is you can imagine if there's some legitimation or seeming legitimation of the Myanmar junta, of the military. Now, what you would potentially see is the EU and more probably the US, wanting to hold back from further engagement with ASEAN, right? After what happened in Washington on January 6th, you can possibly imagine that the current US administration doesn't want to be seen with a bunch of coup leaders. So if one of ASEAN's sort of big pushes is its summit's ability to bring leaders together, if key leaders don't want to appear at ASEAN events, right? ASEAN's claim on being able to sort of draw different actors together to some sort of negotiating forum will be damaged. So these are issues that have to be on the table. They are not new, I would add. How will talk more on this, but ASEAN's inaction on the South China Sea, I think, is reflective of its increasing difficulty in taking initiative. Similarly, if you look at what's going on with the environmental degradation along the Mekong and its effect on livelihoods and also the sort of social consequences along the Mekong, ASEAN's inability, silence, even ignoring of that issue, I think is also indicative of the increasing challenges the organization, the grouping faces in terms of trying to represent the region in some way as the region deals with the challenges from major powers, including growing pressure from the PRC. One of the things that Sebastian had asked me to do is to also think about some of the obstacles that has gotten us to this point. I think with ASEAN, it's useful to recall that past performance is no indicator of future return, right? So for whatever ASEAN's accomplishments during the late Cold War, and perhaps even after, we may have to be ready to consider the fact that we are in new territory, and what used to work may not be able to work as well going forward. And some of this comes down to, for sort of political science talk, a commitment and collective action problems, meaning to say that ASEAN interests are highly diverse. So Southeast Asian countries see things in very different ways. They have different priorities. So even if there's a common goal of preserving the region's interests and autonomy, how this gets interpreted in different regional capitals looks quite different. And so when it comes to an issue like, say, Myanmar or the South China Sea or even the Mekong, different capitals will be pulling in different directions. So these sort of disparate parochial interests prevent ASEAN from being more effective. And the fact that ASEAN has taken so long to come to a meeting over the crisis in Myanmar, I think, is reflective of this divisiveness within the organization. Some of this comes down to the way that ASEAN was designed. As Sebastian also mentioned, right, ASEAN was formed to lower down tension. So what's really good at doing is to slow things down. If there are differences, if there are issues that are highly heated, ASEAN is really, really good at bringing those things down from boiling point, right? So different parties can talk to each other. By that same token, its success in slowing things down also means that it is ill-suited to taking initiative. So things that ASEAN needs to speed, when ASEAN needs to speed things up, when it needs to move things forward quickly, that really good ability to slow things down tends to get in the way. This is, of course, compounded by the sort of well-known fact that ASEAN has to operate by consensus, meaning to say that every single actor has a veto on every single issue. In the Myanmar case, of course, non-intervention becomes a bigger problem. Some of this has to do with the fact that ASEAN is fundamentally a statist organization. It rests on looking at states and state interests, and that sort of non-intervention clause says that things that happen within states stay within states. That's the myth that we all live with, I suppose. But in reality, that is not the case. With the Myanmar situation, with the South China Sea situation, with the Mekong one, it's clear that things don't just stay within borders. We can't keep rivers within borders. We can't keep instability necessarily within borders. So that very status orientation of ASEAN means to say that when there are these trans-boundary types of issues, including the haze that we saw before, ASEAN, tends to be a bit stuck at what to do. And of course, ASEAN has not been prepared to deal with a failed state. There was some talk with Indonesia in 1998, but fortunately, Indonesia pulled through. So that sort of thinking had not moved forward. There are supposedly mechanisms like the High Council to deal with some of these issues, but they've never been used before. And arguably, in a major crisis like the Myanmar situation, we in ASEAN might not know how to use these sorts of instruments. So I would say that these sort of considerations and how to maintain them if ASEAN thinks they're important, while trying to take into account the changing situation that we see around us, would be sort of the challenge facing ASEAN. If we can't in Southeast Asia sort of figure out where we want to go together, then we'll be, I think, terribly ineffective at trying to deal with the major power competition that we see increasing around us. And the consequence may well be that we have to accept less autonomy. That may be a consequence that no one likes, but we may end up being having to actually deal with. So let me end there. I think I'm at about 10 minutes, and I'll hand it off to Ha. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian. That seems like a pretty good place to leave off for Ha's comments, which will address the difficulty of reconciling national and regional interests, and of course, how this has manifested itself in the South China Sea. Ha, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sebastian. And my sincere thanks also go to the diplomat for having me here. It is also a great honor to be in the same panel with Dr. Ivan Lasmana and my good friend Ian Chong. To follow on from Ian's presentation, I would argue that ASEAN's lack of cohesion with regard to the current Myanmar crisis or the ongoing South China Sea disputes underlines the perennial challenge of managing and reconciling the diversity of interests and threat perceptions among its member states, which are shaped and conditioned by their different geographies, historical experiences, the state of their domestic politics, as well as their different foreign policy orientations vis-a-vis the major powers. And that being said, why diversity in Southeast Asia may be structural, I think ASEAN's unity or disunity is also a function of agency. And by that, I mean the different extent to which ASEAN countries see their national interests from the lens of regional interests. In other words, do they consider an integrated, united, and resilient ASEAN as an important constituent part of their national interests? I think the answers vary across ASEAN countries, subject to the issue at stake, and they evolve over time. This nexus between national and regional interests has become far more fraught after ASEAN, I would say, hurried expansion to include all mainland Southeast Asian states in the late 1990s. Apart from the fault lines between the maritime and mainland Southeast Asia, between the older, richer, and the newer, poorer members, and between the more democratic leaning and the more authoritarian, there is also the issue of identification with ASEAN, or the lack thereof among the newer members. I recall that Prof. Alice Ba, in her book published in 2009, she highlighted that the CLMV, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam, did not take part in the original founding dialogue and did not share the defining and socializing difficulties of ASEAN's early years. And this may result in gaps between the CLMV states and the founding members in their appreciation of the role, the value, and the significance of ASEAN to their national interests. Therefore, I think it's perhaps not coincidental that Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines have been more proactive ASEAN members on the Myanmar issue. These countries have been actively engaged in pushing for ASEAN's regional action, arguably because they also look at the Myanmar crisis from the regional lens, as they are deeply concerned over the regional fallouts from the Myanmar situation, as Ian just mentioned, especially with regard to ASEAN's credibility in the eyes of the international community, disruptions to ASEAN community building agenda, and also complications to ASEAN's relations with its dialogue partners, the Western dialogue partners. And meanwhile, the approach by mainland Southeast Asian states, I think, is mainly domestically determined. For Vietnam and Laos, the nature of their ruling regime does not allow them to go very far. They are very conservative when it comes to state control and non-intervention. Meanwhile, the current leadership in Thailand and Cambodia have, over the past decade, administered democratic backsliding in their own countries. Hence, their heightened sensitivity to how this may extrapolate to their own domestic politics. So the lack of ASEAN's unity on the South China Sea issue also manifests this tenuous relationship between national thinking and regional thinking. ASEAN countries have to calibrate their divergent responses according to their perceived national interests, not only in relation to ASEAN, but more importantly to China, which is a vital economic partner to all and also a political ally to some. So China's rising influence has cast a shadow over the growing self-censorship within ASEAN on the South China Sea. And of course, we often talk about Cambodia and for Phnom Penh. I think the security imperative of projecting ASEAN's unity on this matter is simply secondary to the political and economic benefits to be gained by adopting a pro-China position on the South China Sea issue. And that being said, why Cambodia is often named and shamed for acting as a client state of China, I think South ASEAN's this unity on the South China Sea cannot be attributed to Cambodia's free riding alone. And in this, I would like to refer to the State of Southeast Asia survey, which is conducted annually by our institute, the Isis Yusof Ishak Institute, Singapore. The survey unveils a considerable degree of diversity across ASEAN countries on how they perceive the South China Sea issue, even among the claimant states. For example, the South China Sea disputes feature prominently in the security outlooks of the Philippines and Vietnam. For example, in the 2020 edition of the survey, 88.2% of Vietnamese respondents and 82.5% of Philippine respondents chose the flashpoint tensions, including in the South China Sea, as the top security concern. And the Philippines and Vietnamese are also the most distrustful of China, with the South China Sea disputes looming large at the background. But for Brunei, economic downturn was the more pressing problem. And for Indonesia and Malaysia, it was domestic political instability. I also would like to refer to Sebastian, your recent excellent book titled In the Dragon's Shadow, which sheds light on the nuance and texture of the different national experiences of across Southeast Asian states in their dealing with China. And I think abetted by ASEAN's consensus decision-making, this diversity of national experiences, priorities, interests, and dependencies vis-a-vis China means that ASEAN's disunity on the South China Sea issue is here to stay. And in this connection, I would like to highlight two major limitations in ASEAN's current approach to the South China Sea that I wish to emphasize. First, ASEAN's common position on the South China Sea revolves around the principles of peaceful settlement of disputes, no threat or use of force, freedom of navigation, respect for international law, and self-restraint and cooperation. However, beyond these shared principles at the abstract level, ASEAN has not been able to take a strong, principled, and positive stand on specific developments related to the South China Sea. For example, it has failed to endorse the 2016 Arbitral Tribunal's ruling, and it has avoided calling out Chinese encroachments in the maritime zones of some ASEAN member states that obviously contravene international law and UNCLOS. And even though most ASEAN countries would agree to the centrality of UNCLOS in the maintaining of the rules-based regional maritime order, ASEAN as a grouping has not even yet reached a consensus on the formulation that the UNCLOS is the basis for determining maritime entitlements, sovereign rights, jurisdiction, and legitimate interests over maritime zones. And the second limitation to me is related to how this would have impact on Chinese actions on the ground. ASEAN has been engaging with China on the South China Sea issue through the implementation of the 2002 Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea, or the DOC for short, and the ongoing negotiation on the Code of Conduct, of COC. But these diplomatic processes have been of little effect in constraining China's behavior. On the contrary, I think China has been very good at using its engagement with ASEAN as an alibi for its creeping expansionism in the South China Sea. I use the word alibi is to borrow Bilahari's, he used this alibi word on the Myanmar issue, but I find this word also very fit for the South China Sea context too. For example, Beijing's propaganda could claim its confidence building with ASEAN through the DOC and COC processes, but its dredger ships engaged in intensive island building in the South China Sea in the last decade. Another example is the Code of Unplanned Encounters at Sea or CUES that ASEAN and China adopted in the South China Sea. This code, which is applicable to Navy vessels and aircraft, is of little help in dealing with China's increasingly complex gray zone strategy with its force projection involving the PLA, the China Coast Guard, and other maritime forces, which are backing up each other in a layered division of labor, as aptly described recently by Colin Koh, a very prominent expert on maritime security from Singapore. So going forward, I don't think ASEAN as a grouping will be able to take any more robust approach to the South China Sea than what it currently is, even as the developments at sea have evolved dramatically with more tensions and complexities, which interplay with the growing strategic rivalry between the US and China. As a result, I noticed that Southeast Asian claimant states have increasingly looked beyond ASEAN in the search for more credible and substantive countermeasures. For example, soft and hard balancing through cooperation with the Quad grouping and its individual members, or stepping up the lawfare at the United Nations, or being more proactive in settling maritime disputes among themselves, such as the forthcoming MOU to be signed between Malaysia and Vietnam's maritime law enforcement agencies. And as a result, I think ASEAN is increasingly fading further into the background as the actions that truly matter on the South China Sea take place elsewhere. And I will end here and I would be happy to address the questions at a later stage of the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ha. There's certainly a lot to engage with there. I'm going to pass it along to Evan now, who's going to take a bit of a dive back into history and discuss the expansion of ASEAN at the end of the Cold War from its original 5 founding members to the 10 members of the present. Was this all a mistake, Evan?
First, let me say thank you, Sebastian and the diplomat, for having me this morning. So I'll try to address your question in a couple of ways before I get to the point about Myanmar. I think the first point, when it comes to the expansion from the original 6 to 10, I think, on hindsight, it's always 2020, but I do think it was the right decision at that time. I think the changing geopolitics in the post-Cold War era and so forth, I think necessitated that we take steps to embrace and engage all the other Southeast Asian countries into one. The problem, I think, since then isn't so much that the expansion was a mistake, but I think there are 3 problems since then that took us to where we are right now. First of all, I think the problems of economic and political integration within ASEAN was never fully completed. I think the myth of the 2 ASEANs have always been there. I think people try to close the gap economically, politically, and even socially through the ASEAN Charter, the ASEAN Political Security Community Projects, the Economic Community Projects, and the social political ways to integrate the region. I think just as this was being discussed, I think we also expanded too fast and a bit too fiercely, I think, in terms of engaging with external parties. So at a time when we just sort of recovered following the Asian financial crisis, we created the ASEAN Charter. We tried to pushed for integration. We never really actually completed those, and yet we kept expanding our external engagement, whether it's the ASEAN Regional Forum, whether it's the ADMM Plus, or even the East Asia Summit. I think we weren't really on solid ground at that time before we started to believe that we can sort of engage external parties and even transport our way of doing business to external parties. Yes, there was a concern with China's rise and so forth, and so we kind of tried to make sure everybody's a part of an inclusive regional security architecture. But in that effort to expand our external engagement, we never really took pains to make sure that our own intra-ASEAN unity and integration are well maintained. And this is not just in terms of some abstract projects about community building, but also from the very minute detail, like what sort of ambassadorship do you put to your fellow ASEAN members? What kind of political and security and economic investment you put in your fellow ASEAN members? How much do you know about mainland Southeast Asia versus how much do you know about China and US and Australia? I think is very it's actually quite jarring. I think more people know about great power politics and external powers than they know about each other in Southeast Asia. So when something like Myanmar happens, we're all scrambling. We're all trying to figure out, how do we convince Myanmar to do X? How do we get Thailand to do X? How do we convince Vietnam to do Y? How do we make sure that Cambodia doesn't channel too much of China's interest? But it's really difficult when the myth of the two ASEANs persists. When within ASEAN countries, we don't really spend that much time fulfilling our own political, security, and economic integration projects, and yet we're still too busy figuring out how to engage with external powers. So I think that's the first point regarding membership expansion. Secondly, regarding Myanmar and whether or not we should be discussing expulsion and all of that. So the first problem is that there is no provision for expulsion in the ASEAN Charter. I don't know whether the drafters of the charter listen a bit too much of the Eagles, where you can enter but you can never leave kind of thing. But the fact of the matter is there is no mechanism to even review membership, both coming in and out of ASEAN, which is why the problem with East Timor's membership is also a bit of a hangover that we haven't really quite figured out at this point. At best, I think there are conversations about something called suspension of activities, vacancy of seats, or shuffling around key roles, like we did maybe a few years ago when we did not want Myanmar to be chair of ASEAN at a particular year, and we shuffled around. So there are ways to get around kind of the sticks and carrots part from the group vis-a-vis ASEAN, but there is no mechanism for expulsion. I think that's very clear. So what do we do when there's no mechanism for expulsion? The key is to find a consensus among the ASEAN 9 on what to do next. And of course, as the previous speakers have mentioned, this is extremely, extremely difficult, not just in terms of the fact that they have different interests, they have different sense of urgency about what's happening in Myanmar, but also, again, there is a sense of perhaps a bit of, well, we don't really know what to do, so we'll just come out with statements doing X, Y, and Z, but we never actually do anything. And I think Indonesia has been trying to lead an effort to get the group as well as the ASEAN 9 to figure out a way to bring Myanmar from the brink. And I think this is why the upcoming summit, hopefully by the end of this week, can seek to achieve something. But the point being is that without a review of the ASEAN Charter, which I think is a key important agenda that's sort of been on the books and has been discussed for several years now, never actually got anywhere. For that, we actually have a provision within the ASEAN Charter that once it's implemented, that you can review it after 5 years. What Vietnam proposed last year as chair was to review the implementation of the charter, not the provision of the charter itself. What we're trying to push, at least from Indonesia's standpoint, is to push for the review of the charter. I think Ian mentioned earlier about the High Council and so forth. The problem with the charter provision when something like Myanmar happens is that there is no crisis management mechanism. There is a dispute settlement mechanism, not a crisis one. So a dispute is a bit tricky because how would you define the problem in Myanmar as a dispute? It's not like the Thai-Cambodia border. It's not like the South China Sea. It's not really a dispute per se. So the kind of mechanisms that people have been mentioning about Troika, the High Council, and so forth, often refers to the dispute settlement mechanism, the good offices of the Secretary General, the role of the ASEAN chair. Those are all within the provisions of dispute settlement, which is very different from what's happening in Myanmar. So I think to circle back to the point about expansion of membership, the one thing that we have to figure out, aside from going back in terms of the focus of figuring out how to close the gap within ASEAN, rather than spending too much time with external parties, is that we now have to figure out a way to revise the charter. Without a revise of the charter in some form, I don't think we can ever reinvigorate the ideas of a full ASEAN community. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Evan. And thank you all for your opening statements. I think I'll get things kicked off. I'll try and kick off a bit of discussion around the question of what ASEAN should do, what ASEAN members should say to Myanmar's military junta when the special meeting is convened this Saturday. I think a lot of people are, there's a lot of expectation building up around this meeting. I think that probably a lot of people will be disappointed with what comes out of it. But, what is sort of the best case scenario for ASEAN, given its current structural constraints and the sort of the differing interests of the ASEAN 9? We can go. We could start with you, Evan, and then move backward through our three panelists. If that works for you.
Sure. I think a problem is partly bureaucratic and partly political. Obviously, the differing interests. I think that's already given. The problem is also the fact that when you have a summit, it usually doesn't happen where you agree on the summit, right? You have the steps before the summit, whether it's through the senior officials meeting or the foreign ministers meeting. This all must be taken into account because the agenda of the ASEAN chair is sort of set ahead of a year. And of course, with Myanmar, that means you have to change the schedule around. So there is a bit of some bureaucratic challenges there in terms of figuring out, do we have enough time to negotiate let's say a proposal for a humanitarian pause and so forth. I think it's a real challenge. I do think, however, that the problem with Myanmar is also that nobody really wants to touch this. Countries with actual ties and leverage like Singapore and Thailand don't really want to push further ahead and actually use their leverage to do certain things in terms of engagement with Myanmar. And others like Indonesia, we would like to help out with a proposal or a way to get the countries together, but we also realistically don't have a leverage on our own. So we do need to have a collective leadership, I think, with regards to the Myanmar issue. The problem, I think, is to what extent these conversations within the ASEAN 9 should take place first. So therefore, you have some sort of consensus among the 9, and then you approach Myanmar? Or do you actually have a conversation first between a few Southeast Asian member states and Myanmar, and then you bring it to the 9, and then you have a semi-consensus among the 10? I think the sequencing sort of matters. But at this point, as far as we can tell, it's only Indonesia's proposal for a humanitarian pause and assistance that's sort of on the table. And I think this is something that's currently being worked out.
Ian, do you have any thoughts on this question of the special summit this weekend?
I go first?
Sure,
Okay.
yep.
I think in early March, there was the informal ASEAN foreign ministers meeting to discuss exactly the same issue. I think we would not want the upcoming ASEAN summit to end up in the same way as the informal ASEAN foreign ministers. Because for the credibility of the summit, it is considered the supreme policy-making body in ASEAN. So even though ASEAN has no enforcement mechanism or compliance, but the ASEAN summit is important in the sense that, you know, when we have it is the last resort. So we hope that the minimalist approach, whereby you just have a chair statement in which you refers to all issues, and as the Myanmar issue is just one of the many, and you know, ASEAN just expresses its willingness to have, without any concrete arrangement for ASEAN to play a role, a visible role on the ground. I think it would not have ASEAN's credibility as well as the credibility of the ASEAN summit. But the current situation is still very vague and murky. I really don't know how much and how far ASEAN can push the military government. It depends very much on the balance of power on the ground in Myanmar, as well as whether the remaining 9 ASEAN countries can get their act together and exert a united, strong pressure on the military government, and at the meeting whether these leaders can, you know, impress upon Min Aung Hlaing that, you know, it is in the interest of Myanmar, as well as you have to take into account the stake for ASEAN, for ASEAN to be seen in to have a play to play a role in this situation. And I think some kind of middle of the road option would be for Myanmar to allow ASEAN to play a humanitarian role, first of all. And as Ivan mentioned, as long as we can open the door and ASEAN is seen on the ground, maybe the violent crackdown will have to be tempered, and to give some kind of face to ASEAN as well. So I think the situation is still very fluid, and I really don't know how much and how far ASEAN can push the military government. And it depends very much on the objective of the military government when it comes to the summit, whether, you know, it just wants to have a seat at the table for legitimation purpose, like the Kim Jong-un purpose when it is at the Trump summit, you know, instead of, you know, giving any substantive compromise. Thanks.
Ian, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so I would flip the question around and ask, you know, what would it take for the Tatmadaw to want to have any compromise? I guess this sort of lifts off Ha's point. And what can ASEAN do there? Because I think talking and all that, there's no self-evident reason why the Tatmadaw would want to listen to ASEAN or want to give in or want to compromise, especially when they feel that they have the upper hand, right? So what can ASEAN and different ASEAN members do? I think one thing is legitimation. I think Min Aung Hlaing's participation at the ASEAN Chiefs of Defense Force meeting and also this upcoming summit, one of the things that they seem to want, right, is legitimation, which will possibly help them domestically, you know, signaling to the unity government and others that you know, they're not going to get anywhere internationally. So that's one thing ASEAN can withhold or temper or condition, but that's not what ASEAN is currently doing, as it would appear to me. Also, ASEAN has talked about having some sort of negotiated arrangement. Whether they get there's a different question altogether, but a negotiation will involve different sides. So how and whether it decides to bring in the unity government and others is a question that I think remains up in the air. So these, I think, would be the two main things that ASEAN might be able to do collectively. But as Evan and I had mentioned, you know, getting the other ASEAN 9 to sort of figure out you know, how to reach these sorts of goals, you know, it's like pulling teeth, right? So I'm not sure how we're going to get there. Then the other, which Evan had also mentions, what different states would do. And here, I think I agree that Thailand and Singapore probably has more leverage, right? It's about what you can offer them, meaning them being the Tatmadaw, to get them to change course. Whether this is some enticement or whether this is some sort of imposition of cost. So for enticement, there's always a commitment problem, right? You can offer them stuff. What if they take the things on the table and just leave and just walk? And in terms of imposition of cost, there are actually things that, say, Singapore could do, but has avoided. I think there's no political will. So being more transparent about the sorts of business dealings that the Tatmadaw has with Singapore entities, either directly in Singapore or through Singapore subsidiaries or Myanmar subsidiaries of Singapore companies, so on and so forth, where then civil society and others can add pressure. That's one possibility. That's probably more moderate. There is, of course, the possibility of targeted sanctions that call for that put pressure on particular military leaders or military units, the lifting of which will be predicated on negotiation and steps forward on the negotiation process. Another possibility might be to work on some sort of arms embargo, or as well as embargo of dual-use technologies. These are all possibilities. They are not being taken because I don't think it's something that states like Singapore are ready to be upfront and to lead on. So then that means fewer points of leverage on the Tatmadaw. And I mean, I'd add to that. Within ASEAN, there's the other problem of domestic politics that Ha had pointed to, which is basically you have a number of ASEAN states that have sort of leadership or government transition issues of their own. Singapore, of course, is quite distracted with its fourth generation leadership transition. The current Thai government has quite recently had to deal with a series of protests, and then you have questions of leadership in Malaysia as well. So some of the sort of key actors that would usually take a more active role are a bit out of their A game right now. So how we move ahead, I think, is going to be quite trying under these conditions.
Right, thank you. So we'll move on to the Q&A now. We've had a couple of questions that jump off from the points you've all been making about this weekend summit, and we've got a couple of questions that ask if there's any possibility of ASEAN engaging with the newly announced National Unity Government representing the ousted NLD administration, and if so, through what forms or mechanisms? Do any of you see any likelihood of ASEAN recognizing or perhaps engaging with this National Unity Government, which has a strong moral claim to represent the will of the majority of the Myanmar people?
I can take a stab at it first if you want.
Sure.
I think it's going to be tricky. I mean, it's something that has to be done if we're looking at some sort of negotiated settlement. So you have to have the different parties at the table. However, it's going to set up a very tricky precedent for ASEAN. So ASEAN's very statist non-intervention view, what this effectively means is to say they're going to be talking to a group that might be a challenger alternative regime within a country. Does that then open the door for sort of other similar kinds of talks with other entities within different ASEAN states who also have issues with secession and questions about the legitimacy of various governments? So I think there will be some worry about that kind of precedent, despite the fact that it's probably necessary for a negotiated settlement to bring the unity government on board somehow.
Sure. I think there's 2 points that have to be made clear about the NUG. One is Are we talking about the goal for the upcoming summit? Or are we talking about beyond? And number two, I think there's a distinction to be made between existence and legitimacy. I think it has to be made clear that ASEAN cannot determine who is legitimate to represent the people of Myanmar. The legitimacy question has to be decided by the people of Myanmar themselves. So ASEAN cannot decide on legitimacy in that sense. As far as existence goes, I think it's not surprising to know that regional countries, including China, have acknowledged the existence of non-Tatmadaw entities and stakeholders, whether it's the RPH or whether now it's NUG. I think there is an ongoing communication with regional governments as well. So the point being is that if the goal of the summit now, I think is coming very soon, I think we have to be clear that for the upcoming summit, there are three maximalist or super ideal goals to achieve. One is to end the violence, and two is to deliver some form of humanitarian aid to the people of Myanmar, and three, to figure out a way that ASEAN can facilitate a Myanmar-led and a Myanmar-owned dialogue process. ASEAN cannot determine the content of its dialogue or how it's going to come about. ASEAN can facilitate the process, but the content of the dialogue and therefore the legitimacy of whichever entity is being discussed depends on the people of Myanmar themselves. So I think if the goal of the summit now is within these three broad parameters, I think it's sort of clear that we have to make some difficult choices. That doesn't mean we don't acknowledge the existence of NUG, but I think in the lead up to the summit in which we need to end the violence, we do have to make some difficult choices, including having that conversation with representatives from the SAC. In the future, however, beyond the summit, are we excluding the possibility of perhaps less interaction with SAC and more interaction with NUG? Of course, that's a possibility. But right now, what we're concerned about is the summit. So we need to figure out a way to make the summit a success. And if we get into a debate about who is the legitimate representatives, when we obviously don't have the credibility to do so, because it is up to the people of Myanmar, it's not up to us, I think that would derail the chance of the summit. And right now, as of today, there is no other option. Is there a UNSC option? Is there a unilateral intervention option? Is there an R2P option on the table? Not right now. So right now, the only option for a regional diplomatic breakthrough is ASEAN. So right now, I think we're all concerned about how do we make sure that the summit is a success, because as Ha mentioned, it is a possibility that we might get a repetition from the informal foreign ministers meeting a couple of months ago, where there seems to be a conversation, you say your piece, I say my piece, and then we all go home. And I think that's what we don't want. I think we want a commitment from the ASEAN states, including Myanmar, on how we can get them on board on in terms of ending the violence and deliver aid and restart dialogue. I think that's the main goal right now.
Do you have anything to add to that, or should I move to the next question?
Please move on.
Okay. We've got a question here from John Brandon from the Asia Foundation, I believe, in DC. If ASEAN cannot take initiative, especially during times of crisis, should ASEAN and extra-regional powers no longer emphasize the importance of ASEAN's centrality in the broader Asian regional architecture? I think, Ian, you touched on this to some extent in your opening remarks, but the question of centrality, going forward, is it fair to sort of, to condition ASEAN's centrality on its successful resolution of this crisis, and what does it even mean for ASEAN to occupy a position of centrality within the broader Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific, in a context of increasing superpower rivalry? Do any of you want to have a stab at that?
Do you want to go?
Okay. The way the question is framed seems to me that the person who asked the question really takes ASEAN centrality very seriously. I think ASEAN centrality has many dimensions, and ASEAN still needs to sing the theme of ASEAN centrality because it serves their interests. For example, for Vietnam, when you talk about the South China Sea issue, it is very important for Vietnam to emphasize that ASEAN has the centrality on this issue, because we need to make sure that international law prevails, the UNCLOS prevails, for example, and the dialogue partners, the major powers, when they mention that they support ASEAN centrality, it means that ASEAN plays an important role in their engagement with the region that serves their economic, political, or strategic interests. So we cannot look at ASEAN only purely from the Myanmar lens, because ASEAN has other values and that cannot be determined simply by how it approaches and whether it can help address the Myanmar issue. So, but of course, the Myanmar issue is very important, and it is really corrosive to ASEAN's credibility. I would not use the word centrality, because centrality to me is quite a fabricated term. ASEAN's credibility is more relevant in this context, because the Myanmar issue happens in its own backyard. And if ASEAN doesn't play a meaningful role in effecting positive change, then it will face, it will have a very serious fallout to the region. And it has a member state on the brink of a failed state. And also the likelihood of a full-blown civil war in its own backyard, which is really, really serious. So ASEAN must be central to its own people and its own member states, and that is important. But to say that, ASEAN, the Myanmar issue is the single determinant of ASEAN's centrality in the broader geopolitical landscape, I don't think so.
I could add on to that, if that's okay. So I think ASEAN will emphasize its own centrality just out of self-interest, but the question is not so much what ASEAN thinks, but what how various Southeast Asian countries act. And here, I think Ha's earlier opening comments give us a clue, right? Where their efforts to reach out and work with extra regional powers on a variety of issues. I think this is suggestive of a certain degree of lack of confidence in what ASEAN centrality might mean. I mean, it's ASEAN centrality to sort of be central, to drive things, that's an aspiration, but whether that aspiration or when that aspiration can come to fruition remains a question. And I think I don't think ASEAN centrality, so on and so forth, rises or falls on the Myanmar issue. Indeed, its relevance and credibility too. I think what the Myanmar crisis is highlighting is sort of ongoing chronic problems within ASEAN. As I've mentioned, right, the efforts to address the South China Sea issue via ASEAN has been at best slow and at worst sort of riven by division. The Mekong issue that I had highlighted in the beginning doesn't even come up, even though this affects mainland Southeast Asian states quite significantly. So if ASEAN has a claim to centrality, it's not just how the organization positions itself, it's how it watches out for the interests and concerns of various members, even if the sort of effects, right, that the various members are feeling aren't sort of evenly spread across the organization. And so to the extent that ASEAN has difficulties in reaching these sorts of goals, then Southeast Asian states may be looking at other partners to do various kinds of engage in various kinds of activities to solve various kinds of problems that they face, and that may potentially sort of undermine ASEAN's position and its over time its ability to represent the region, which is a real concern, but one that I think we should sort of be aware of, rather than to sort of keep repeating centrality and to sort of pretend doesn't exist. So, I mean, ultimately, you can be central, but completely ineffective and inconsequential.
Okay.
If I can add very quickly on that point, I think the biggest problem with ASEAN centrality as a concept is that ASEAN member states define it differently than external partners. External partners define it in terms of outcome and to what extent can ASEAN solve problems, whether it's solving Myanmar, solving South China Sea, and so forth. Where ASEAN, as can be seen in the charter, ASEAN centrality is about agenda setting. It's about process. It's about process of continuous engagement with external parties through ASEAN-led mechanisms, whether it's the ARF, ADMM Plus, or others. So these two starting points that's completely different, I think, is why we always have a debate about glass half full, half empty when it comes to ASEAN centrality. But I do agree with Ha as well that it is not defined solely by one issue, whether it's the South China Sea or Myanmar. I think there's a wider regional architecture that needs to be taken into account. Secondly, it should be clear as well that ASEAN centrality is not designed to please external partners. Just because the external partners are not happy with ASEAN in how ASEAN does things, that doesn't mean ASEAN centrality is diminished. When things are hard with Myanmar in the early days of the coup, who did the UN Special Representative to Myanmar try to communicate with? They tried to communicate with ASEAN member states. So to suggest that ASEAN is simply irrelevant, it doesn't seem to be the case. In fact, regional partners from China, from India, and Japan, they all support in terms of ASEAN's effort to address Myanmar. Now, we can disagree about why they support ASEAN's efforts, but I do think that in this particular instance, I don't really see the missing part of ASEAN centrality in Myanmar. I think right now we're front and center. Are we going to be successful at it? That's a different matter. But in terms of the effort, we are central.
Okay. Well, we've just hit time, and so I think we'll wrap things up. On behalf of the Diplomat, I'd like to once again extend my gratitude to our three panelists. We could have continued to mull over these questions for another hour, I'm sure. There's a lot more that we didn't get to, but it just suggests how complex these issues are, and yes. So once again, thank you so much to the three of you for sharing your insights with us, with our audience. And I look forward to potentially seeing you all here again at some time in the future. For the rest of you, anyone interested in reading our extensive coverage of the Asia Pacific can go to thediplomat.com. And we will be holding more regular webinars about once a month. And so details of those will be made public on our Facebook and Twitter feeds, as well as on our website. So thank you again for attending, and all the best for the rest of the day.
Thank you very much.